Throughout World of Warcraft's 20-year history, Blizzard has created some absolutely incredible raid boss encounters, from the humble beginnings of Molten Core to the cosmic showdowns in Antorus the Burning Throne. Raid bosses have pushed players to their limits with complex mechanics and intense difficulty, but some of the best moments in raiding aren't necessarily just the bosses themselves. They're the secret phases, or indeed the completely secret bosses that caught everyone off guard. These are the additional challenges that only appeared on the hardest difficulties, revealing more lore about the fight, testing players in new ways, or just straight up changing everything you knew about the fight. Today I want to go over what for me are 10 of the craziest secret phases in World of Warcraft's history. The moments where the best raiders got to the end of the fight and then realized that it had only just begun. So with that said, let's make a start. At number 10 I've got the hidden boss from the Throne of Thunder, Raden. After defeating Lei Shen on heroic difficulty, the Thunder King himself in the Throne of Thunder, heroic raiders discovered that there was a secret 13th hidden boss, Raden, the Fallen Keeper of Storms. And this wasn't just some bonus boss either tacked on for good measure. This was a full-on lore revelation about the origins of the Mogul Empire and of Lei Shen's power. Lei Shen had incapacitated Raden and bound him beneath the Throne of Thunder and stolen his power. It was an extra piece of the puzzle of the Mists of Pandaria story that normal mode just really didn't answer whatsoever. The fight itself was mechanically interesting, albeit quite straightforward. Raden would summon orbs of anima and vita energy, and then players had to carefully manage which ones they killed versus which one they left alive. That would decide which mechanics the boss would use. This fight was always hidden, so it was quite simple in its design. If you executed the mechanics correctly, it wasn't too much of a problem, albeit very healing intense, but if you made any real mistakes, there were a lot of instant wipe moments. Still though, it's always cool to see an entirely new boss. At number 9 we've got Sinestra from the Bastion of Twilight, and this was Cataclysm's first hidden, heroic-only boss. After taking down Cho'Gall in the Bastion of Twilight, heroic raiders had one more challenge to overcome, as the floor beneath you would collapse, revealing a secret chamber of the raid's true final boss, Sinestra. Now Sinestra started the fight in a weakened state. She only had 60% of her maximum health and dealt 40% reduced damage. But that shouldn't have fooled you into thinking that this was an easy fight. The mechanics were absolutely brutal. Rack was the debuff that dealt ramping shadow damage over time, and when it was dispelled it would bounce to 2 nearby players while retaining its remaining duration but resetting the damage. So if you dispelled Rack too quickly, it would spread throughout your entire raid and you'd wipe, so you had to absolutely be on the ball and have a few people assigned to dealing with this. The biggest mechanic by far though was the Twilight Slicer. 2 shadowy orbs would spawn next to 2 random players and create a beam of Twilight energy between them. Anyone caught in that beam would get one shot instantly. The orbs would also pulse heavy damage to anyone within 5 yards of them, so the targeted players only had a few seconds to identify who had the orbs and to run them out the raid over to the edges of the room. Even during Cataclysm Classic with all our modern weak auras, identifying who had the orbs quickly enough was still an absolute nightmare. If you ever did this boss, you know how much of a problem the orbs were. Players who defeated Sinestra on heroic would also get the Dragon Slayer title, and there was also a particularly brutal achievement called I Can't Hear You Over the Sound of How Awesome I Am, which involved defeating Sinestra on heroic difficulty on your first attempt without letting any raid member die, meaning a flawless boss kill, which even in modern classic was still pretty difficult to do. Sinestra very much set a precedent for Cataclysm's raid design. Hidden bosses weren't just going to be harder versions of what you've already seen, they were going to be entirely new challenges. And number 8 we have what is probably the original secret boss, Algalon the Observer from Ulduar. This was kind of the boss that started it all. Before Algalon you just had raid bosses and you go through them in order, and Ulduar was the only raid tier ever to feature the hard mode difficulty, and Algalon was the only hard mode only boss ever. To even access Algalon in the first place, you needed to assemble the Celestial Planetarium key. First you had to defeat the Assembly of Iron on hard mode, and then you'd unlock some additional quests where you had to defeat the Keepers of Ulduar on hard mode too. And after you've gone through that whole process and got the key, you could start the fight. But here's where things started to get really interesting. On Algalon you didn't have unlimited attempts as you typically would on a boss. When Algalon first launched, and he worked this way during Wrath Classic for a long time too, you would have 1 hour to defeat him per lockout. As soon as you pulled the boss, the timer timer began, and that was it for your entire week. Blizzard would refer to him as Algalon the Raid Destroyer for a good reason, because this boss was also very difficult. The 1 hour timer very much fit into Algalon's lore as well. He had been sent by the Titans to survey Azeroth and to check for signs of corruption, and his conclusion was the planet wasn't doing so well, so we're going to entirely blow it up and start again. So when you're fighting Algalon, you're fighting against a timer where they're going to re-originate Azeroth, so no pressure or anything. The fight itself wasn't too mechanically difficult really, it's just he did an unbelievably high amount of tank damage, meaning your healers were constantly sweating, and there was one person that needed to deal with collapsing stars. These would gradually lose health, and when they died they would explode for a massive amount of raid damage. So one person had to damage the stars, so they died in a staggered fashion. The majority of your other DPS though just had to DPS hard, because this fight was also a bit of a DPS check. And after you defeat Algalon, you go turn the quest in Dalaran, and Ronin will give his speech. A speech, an event that was very rare back in the day. You'd have no idea what was going on, but in Wrath Classic, I swear at peak time, people would be queuing up to hand this thing in. Nevertheless, the Algalon encounter and its hidden nature was super cool, and it set in motion so many bosses to come. At number 7 we have Argus the Unmaker from Antorus, the final encounter of Legion, and this boss had one of the most visually stunning secret phases in WoW history. On Mythic mode from the very start, the fight was different. Sargeras himself intervened, and his influence was felt throughout the entire encounter. The most significant Mythic-only mechanic was Sargeras' gaze. He would give players either Sargeras' rage or fear. If you had fear, you had to stack close with other players or you'd take a massive amount of damage, and if rage, the opposite, where you had to go and stand by yourself. And as the fight went on, more and more players were affected by this, so you had to plan this debuff around the other mechanics that were going on. But the real surprise came in Phase 3, as alluded to from the Dungeon Journal, where it says when Argus reaches 40% health, he is sufficiently weakened such that Aman'Thul is able to subdue him. Or so it seems. This really was the culmination of an expansion-long story, and the story in Legion for me was one of the better ones throughout the duration of WoW. Argus wasn't just another end boss, he was the corrupted world soul of the Eridar homeworld. Sargeras had found this titan, bound his essence to serve the Burning Legion, and used Argus's power to continually resurrect fallen demons. As long as Argus existed, the Burning Legion could not be defeated, so this represented a huge moment. Another thing that separated Argus out from final bosses and added up to the whole grandeur of the encounter was the fact that the Pantheon themselves aided in the encounter. When Argus did his one-shot attack on the entire raid, you didn't just wipe, Eonar came to your help and resurrected you. It's almost a bit of a throwback to the Lich King encounter where everyone gets resurrected at the end and has to keep on fighting. For me, what makes the secret parts of Argus so cool is just how it ties into the overall lore of the game, which makes it a little bit different from some other bosses on this list. Number 6 takes us to the Shah of Fear from the Terrace of Endless Spring. On normal difficulty, the Shah of Fear was already a relatively challenging multi-phase fight, but when you stepped into heroic mode and pushed the boss to 66% health, everything changed. The entire raid was teleported to a new location called the Dread Expanse. This was kind of the Shah's home territory, deep within the realm of fear itself. During this phase transition, players also had all cooldowns reset so they could start blasting, and they would need to because this boss had an absolutely massive amount of health. This final phase introduced several new mechanics which didn't exist in normal mode. Players would receive the Pure Light buff, which granted immunity to fear and horror effects, reduced incoming damage by 30%, but also made you unable to move. And you could also transfer this buff to another player via an extra action button. It was like a game of hot potato. Meanwhile, the boss would use Huddle in Terror, terrorizing random players and dealing heavy shadow damage to anyone near them. The Shah would also periodically submerge and then emerge under a random player, summoning an increasing number of dread spawns each time. This is where the phase started to get really challenging. The dread spawns would fixate on whoever had the Pure Light buff. These adds would then gain stacks of gathering speed, moving faster and faster, and if they ever reached their target, they pretty much would one-shot them. The only way to reset their movement speed was to transfer the Pure Light buff onto another player. But, and this was the biggest problem of the entire phase, every single time you transferred the Pure Light buff, every dread spawn would immediately cast Shah Spine, dealing heavy shadow damage to random raid members. So it was kind of like a balancing act. If you transferred the light too often, you'd kill your raid with Shah Spine casts, but if you didn't transfer it fast enough, the ads would reach the player, kill them, and then start rampaging throughout the raid. Overall, this boss probably had a bit too much health on heroic mode, Nevertheless, it was an interesting extra phase. At number 5, we're looking at Archimonde's mythic phase in Hellfire Citadel, and this one literally drags you into the Twisting Nether. Archimonde was already a very difficult fight on Heroic, one of the most difficult fights ever for its time, but when Archimonde reached 40% health on mythic difficulty, he activated his ultimate ability, teleporting the entire raid into a whole other realm. The boss would also heal back up to 50% health when this happened, so you still had a long way to go. Similar to Argus, this fight had important lore implications as well, because demons can only die permanently if they die within the Twisting Nether, otherwise they will just resurrect. And Archimonde had just taken you into the Twisting Nether, so this was very much a do or die situation. The mythic phase brought several new mechanics that made this fight very challenging to do. You had Seething Corruption on the floor, which was kind of like a dance mechanic where you had to dodge the explosions. Mark of the Legion was a split soak debuff that had to be shared properly, and Void Stars would spawn and fixate on players, and if they reached them, they were going to blow you off the edge of the platform. You also had Infernal Doombringers too that had to be killed off before they gained full energy. There were just so many positioning requirements on this boss, on top of a hard DPS check to beat. To put it in perspective, the world first from Method here took 472 attempts, and it does remain one of the longest progression races for a single boss in World of Warcraft history. Archimonde very much living up to his name here. During our second encounter with him, after our initial one during TBC was quite a bit easier. And number 4 is Imperator Margok from Highmaul, and this fight featured as one of the most unexpected boss swaps we've seen in WoW history. This was also the first raid tier ever to be rolled out on Mythic mode. Now Mythic mode had existed for Siege of Orgrimmar during the Warlords of Draenor pre-patch, however the world first over there was done on Heroic mode. So really Highmaul was the start of Mythic. I remember progressing a good amount of this fight, and I can tell you it was seriously complicated and extremely long in duration. There were so many different spell combinations that you had to deal with perfectly, and if you lost players early on, you'd just have to wipe and go again. You needed those resurrections for later. But on Mythic mode, there was a whole extra challenge added. When you finally were getting Margok towards no health, ready to claim the win, Cho'Gall showed up. He would then drain the remaining energy from Imperator, and you'd then have to defeat this new boss to really end the encounter. Similar to a lot of these secret bosses or hidden phases, the mechanics on display here were relatively simple. You had debuffs that had to be healed up in a staggered fashion, otherwise the raid would take too much damage at the same time, and the boss would also spawn a massive amount of ads, leading to certain specs being unexpectedly very good here. Enhancement Shaman ended up being perfect for this fight due to how they could spread Flame Shock for all the enemies, and then Fire Nova would proc off each enemy with Flame Shock. This final encounter against Cho'Gall was really all about defeating him before you got completely overwhelmed by how many ads there were. It was a relatively difficult opening tier for Warlords of Draenor, and despite this expansion's issues, I think you can say that the raiding was overall good. And number 3, I've got Garrosh Hellscream's heroic only phase from the Siege of Orgrimmar, and this one was another bit of a lore bomb to see in first person. The normal version of the Garrosh fight was already epic and long in duration, but eventually you'd bring down the warmongering war chief and roll credits, the expansion was over, right? Well, not so much on heroic difficulty, because on heroic difficulty, Garrosh would heal up one final time and send you into a vision of his future. This was a twisted reflection of Stormwind Harbour, where Garrosh's Iron Horde had won, and it lay burning and in ruins. In this phase, Garrosh was healed up to 60% health and would gain some brand new abilities. Malice was a debuff he'd cast on random non-tank players, forcing constant repositioning. He also had an energy bar similar to his other phases, and he would empower his abilities, dealing massive raid or tank damage. One of the trickiest new mechanics for this phase involved the Iron Stars and Manifest Rage. So Garrosh would periodically summon Iron Stars, the same massive spike wheels you've been dodging throughout the Siege of Orgrimmar. Sometime after, Garrosh would start casting Manifest Rage, and you needed to interrupt this cast by driving an Iron Star right into him. This would either need to happen during the wind-up for the cast or shortly afterwards. If the Iron Star was messed up or it hit too late, Garrosh would have summoned a bunch of ads, and the chances were going to be you'd get overwhelmed and wiped. There's also a bit of a fun technical detail about this fight too. Garrosh was designed to have a massive health pool for the final encounter of the expansion. His total health was somewhere around 3.7 billion or so, and the maximum value numbers could go up to under a 32-bit integer is about 2.1 billion. This is why he kept having to heal over the duration of the fight, where you go into the heart, defeat him in there, then go back to the regular phase, and then go back in, and then go back out. And, well, if you've ever done the fight, you know how it looks. There are a lot lot of phases here. It's definitely been one of the more epic boss fights and a well-remembered villain in the World of Warcraft story. At second place, I've got Gul'dan in the Nighthold, where the Mythic phase was an amazing throwback to the Illidan encounter. On Mythic mode, this encounter didn't have the delay at the start where Gul'dan would summon a bunch of minions and charge up power. You got into the action straight away, so it was difficult right from the moment you began. Similar to many other boss fights here, this fight was incredibly long and complex, having you deal with overlapping mechanics, wind trying to knock you off the edge of the platform, a bunch of different demonic summons, and tons more. But the real surprise came when you were just about to beat the fight. In normal or heroic, you'd defeat Gul'dan and Khadgar would use Light's Heart to restore Illidan's soul to his body. The Betrayer would then awaken, kill off Gul'dan in a cutscene, ending the Nighthold tier. On Mythic mode, something went very wrong, or right, depending on how you look at it. When Gul'dan attempted to infuse Sargeras' essence into Illidan's body, the ritual partially succeeded. So Sargeras' demonic soul, the essence of the Dark Titan himself, manifested partially within inside Illidan, creating an entire new entity, the Demon Within. This wasn't Illidan himself, but he used abilities as though he was. Soul Sever was very much like Shear, where he'd do massive damage to his primary target, except in this version there would be shards of the target's soul that had split off, and people had to go and pick them up again. There was also a time slot field in this fight too that was crucial, because at certain points he would use visions of the Dark Titan, which would instantly kill every single player every second for 15 seconds, which sounds like pretty overkill to me. He would also spawn demons as fragments of Azzinoth that had to be fought, very similar to the flames of Azzinoth during the original fight in TBC, and there was one player who was surrounded by bulwarks of Azzinoth. When players finally defeat the Demon Within, Illidan is returned to normal and the final cutscene plays out as intended, but this for me has to be one of the most epic secret phases we've ever seen in World of Warcraft. And at the number one spot just feels like such an icon to me that I have to put it here, and that is Ragnaros' secret phase in the Firelands. With Cataclysm we had a whole expansion centered around elemental lords and their conflict, so it only made sense that the Fire Lord would return. And on 25 player heroic difficulty, when you were just about to defeat Ragnaros, instead of him despawning and escaping the encounter, he would get bound by the NPCs nearby, forcing him to stand up out of his pool and face you in a final showdown. What made this so epic is the throwback to vanilla, where Ragnaros was always just there, static in place. Players would have imagined for years what would happen if he suddenly grew legs and stood up out of his pool, and here it was actually happening. You can only imagine what people felt like when this first happened. This final phase was also pretty difficult, and the NPCs that bound Ragnaros in place would be absolutely key in defeating him. Cenarius would create breadth of frost on the ground. These ice patches were critical, as players standing inside them would be saved from a debuff that was ticking on all players, and they would also be needed to kill off living meteors that were chasing random players. Malfurion would create cloud bursts. This could be picked up and then players could use it to clear out Dreadflame, which would allow other raiders safe zones to stand in. And Hamel Rune Totem would cast Entrapping Roots. At points throughout the fight, the boss had to be kited into this, otherwise he would one-shot the entire raid. This fight was really about dealing with the last living meteors and ensuring that the boss was kited into roots correctly, because sometimes the roots just spawned in horrible spots and it was really difficult to deal with. The difficulty spike on this encounter in particular was absolutely crazy. Paragon, who got the World First tier and who had been scoring World First since Lich King 25 Heroic, published a strategy guide for Phase 4, calling it the most mechanically demanding final phase they had ever faced. The execution had to be very much near perfect, with every player fulfilling their role flawlessly whilst adapting to all the incoming mechanics. What elevated this phase just being beyond difficult was the surprise factor too. Nobody expected Ragnaros to randomly just stand up and start walking around, and similar to some other lore drops within this video, an elemental lord dying in an elemental plane, kind of like a demon in the Twisting Nether, means they're not coming back. And for all those reasons, that's why I've got Ragnaros at the number one spot. But there you have it, 10 mythic only phases or secret bosses throughout World of Warcraft's history. There are a few more than this even, which I didn't include, so definitely let me know which ones you would have included instead, and whether you have progressed any of these encounters yourself. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.